There we are. We are just going to cross live now and hear what the Secretary of State and the Foreign Secretary have to say.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is, as always, a great pleasure to have Foreign Secretary Cameron here at the State Department in Washington. We were just together, literally sitting next to each other, for the NATO meetings that we had in Brussels last week. But we've had an ongoing conversation, an ongoing consultation about the major challenges that both of our countries are facing and facing together. And today was another important chapter in those conversations. Starting with Ukraine, we of course reaffirmed the imperative of continuing to support and help Ukraine defend itself against the ongoing Russian aggression. I have to say that the United Kingdom has been an extraordinary leader in this effort from day one, imposing sanctions and export controls on Russia, and hindering its ability to continue to finance the war, ramping up investments in the defense industrial base. This is a major effort that our two countries are engaged in with many other countries, both for immediate needs, but also for the future. We have major British defense companies that are opening offices in Kyiv, working jointly with our Ukrainian friends, helping Ukraine develop its own defense products. And the UK was the first country to formalize and finalize the bilateral security agreements that 30 countries have either now concluded negotiations on or are in the process of negotiating with Ukraine to help Ukraine develop a future force, one that can deter aggression and defend itself in the future. We talked about ways to strengthen efforts to prevent the transfer and weapons of material to Russia for use in Ukraine. And this is an ongoing challenge, and we see weapons, we also see technologies to support the defense industrial base in Russia coming from North Korea, from Iran, from China. This is an area of particular concern for not only the United States and the United Kingdom, but many of our allies and partners throughout Europe. We also talked about the imperative of getting assistance to Ukraine now in terms of additional munitions, air defenses, artillery. We both heard last week from the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba at NATO about the immediate needs. Both of our countries are pressing ourselves and pressing others to do this. And in that light, the supplemental budget request that President Biden has made of Congress is urgent and it's imperative. House is now back in session. We look to see that brought before the House and to get a vote as quickly as possible. And again, I've said this before, but it is always worth reminding that when it comes to burden sharing, I have never seen a better example in my time in government now over 30 years. The United States has done extraordinary things for Ukraine. Our European partners and others beyond Europe around the world have done even more over the last 2 years. Military support, economic support, humanitarian support. So there's genuine burden sharing and carrying the load. We need to continue to do our part. And again, I'll remind that the overwhelming majority of the resources in the supplemental budget request will actually be invested right here in the United States, in our own defense industrial base to produce what Ukraine needs, but providing in the meantime good American jobs. We, of course, discussed the situation in the Middle East and in Gaza. Israel has made important commitments to significantly increase the supply of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza and has taken some initial actions as well to move on those commitments. We're looking at a number of critical things that need to happen in the coming days, including opening a new northern point of entry for assistance into Gaza, using Ashdod on a regular basis, maximizing the flow of assistance from Jordan, as well as putting in place a much more effective deconfliction mechanism with the humanitarian groups that are providing assistance. Just yesterday, more than 400 trucks were cleared to go into Gaza, and that is the most since October 7th in any given day. But what matters is results and sustained results. And this is what we will be looking at very carefully in the days ahead. And that includes making sure that the assistance that gets into Gaza is distributed effectively throughout Gaza, not just in the south or in central Gaza. It has to get to the north as well. Of course, we have our own citizens who remain hostage in Gaza, held by Hamas. We continue to work very closely with Israel, with Egypt, with Qatar, on getting an agreement that will result in an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages, and also create even better conditions for surging assistance to those who need it in Gaza. Two other quick things I wanted to touch on. In the Indo-Pacific, our two countries are aligned on the key issues before us in the Indo-Pacific: ensuring peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, standing up when the PRC is engaged in unfair trade practices and non-market practices, including addressing the global economic consequences of Chinese industrial overcapacity and the need for a level playing field. Secretary Yellen spoke very clearly and forcefully to this during her recent trip to China. This is an ongoing concern for our countries and for many other countries around the world. And of course, we have our AUKUS agreement, modernizing partnerships to meet future challenges, to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. Australia's selection last month of British companies to develop nuclear-powered submarines is a milestone in actually integrating our defense industrial bases. We also discussed partnerships with other countries through AUKUS, including one that we'll discuss with Japan when Prime Minister Kishida is here this week, and having partners engaged, particularly in Pillar 2 activities, is something that will carry this partnership forward. Finally, we're working together in this hemisphere to address shared interests and to try to advance peace, security, and opportunity. I welcome the conversations that we had about that as well. With that, David, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. It's very good to be back in Washington, very good to be back with you. In a time of danger like this in international affairs, close alliances really matter. And there is no closer alliance for us than our partnership with the United States. And I think the work we've been doing here and in NATO and what we'll be doing at the G7 really demonstrates that. On Ukraine, I want to echo what Tony said. Put simply, we know what works, we know what they need, and we know what is right for us. In terms of what works, we know that if we give the Ukrainians the support they deserve, they can win this war, they can achieve the just peace that they deserve. They've sunk 25% of Russia's Black Sea fleet. They've inflicted over 350,000 casualties on Russian armed forces who launched this unprovoked and unjustified aggression. And we know that if we keep on backing them, we can lead this to the right conclusion. And we know what they need. We know they need air defenses. The Ukrainian foreign minister was so clear about that in NATO. We know they need ammunition. There's the excellent Czech initiative to bring forward ammunition. That's going to arrive in June, and even before that, Britain is taking action to source more ammunition for them in the run-up to that. We know that they need support from NATO allies and a good outcome to the NATO summit, which we were discussing this morning. And we know that they need money in the form of the frozen Russian sovereign assets, and we're making good progress in how to access that funds on an agreed basis that I think we can take forward at the G7. And of course, in terms of the money they need and the support they need, perhaps nothing is more important than the supplemental that the Congress is looking at the moment. And I come here with no intention to lecture anybody or tell anybody what to do or get in the way of the process of politics and other things in the United States. I just come here as a great friend and believer in this country, and a believer that it's profoundly in your interests and your security and your future and the future of all your partners to release this money and let it through. And I'm looking forward to meetings I'm going to be having in Congress later today. And above all, we know what's right for us. We know that it is right to stop Putin's aggression. We know it's right for our own militaries and our own production bases to ramp up production, not just for Ukraine, but for our own stocks. And as Tony said, so many of the jobs created will be jobs created here in the United States, and indeed, when we're dealing with our own weapon systems, jobs in the UK. We know it's right to send this very clear message to all those watching around the world, including China, that we stand by our allies, that we don't reward aggression, that we help those who are trying to fight it off. And we know it's right for our own security. That leads to the NATO conference. We had some excellent discussions. I remember chairing the NATO summit in Wales in 2014. Back then, only 3 countries met the 2 percentage points of GDP on defence spending. I'm proud to say Britain was one of them. We're now up to around 20 countries out of an alliance of 32 members. And I think we can make real progress between now and the summit in Washington with every country showing how they're going to get from where they are now to that 2%. And I would urge all those countries to think about how they can do it. And we'll also be looking at this mission for Ukraine about how NATO can do more to coordinate and help that country in its struggle. On our discussions on Israel and Gaza, as I said at the weekend, we see this in 4 very clear ways. 1, we back the hostages and their families who are now in day 185 of their appalling captivity. We go hard on getting aid into Gaza. It's the right thing to do. And what was previously seen as impossible is now possible, and that is hugely welcome. We want to see that followed up. We believe in leading internationally, both at the United Nations, where we achieved a good resolution on a temporary ceasefire during Ramadan, and also putting together countries that back and support a future peace process, such as met in Munich, and we hope we'll meet again shortly. But the 4th part of our plan is to support Israel in its legitimate right of self-defense to deal with the Hamas threat, and it's important we maintain that support. On aid, just to be clear, as Tony said, we want to see 500 trucks a day. We want to see the water switch back on. We want to see Ashdod and a northern crossing point opened. And crucially, we want to see this deconfliction, because getting aid to Gaza on its own isn't enough. You've got to be able to get aid around Gaza. And as we saw with the tragic killing of the World Central Kitchen workers, unless you have that deconfliction, other things like that could happen. We have a very clear plan A for how we bring this conflict to an end. We have a temporary pause. We turn that into a sustainable ceasefire. We see Hamas leaders removed from Gaza. We see the terrorist infrastructure taken down. That is the way to have a political process that brings the war to an end. But we have to be aware, if that doesn't work, we have to think about what is plan B. What can humanitarian and other organizations do to make sure that if there is a conflict in Rafah, that people can achieve safety, they can get food, they can get water, they can get medicine, and people are kept safe. And I think that's something we're going to have to be looking at, and we were talking about today. Finally, on the other things you mentioned, I totally agree that AUKUS is a really important alliance. And I think one of the ways we can make it a success, as well as making sure we build our submarines and invest on time, is making progress on the ITAR regulations. If we're going to have a partnership as close as this between 3 like-minded countries, you must be able to have the free flow of munitions between us. Finally, I just wanted to mention Haiti, where Secretary Blinken has said how important it is that we all step forward and help. Britain has a number of priorities in that region, including neighbouring countries that we are responsible for, but nonetheless we will be providing over £5 million, $7 million to the fund to help support Haiti. So on these areas and many others, we've had an excellent conversation, excellent meeting, and it shows how like-minded we are on trying to make progress on these difficult conflicts that are so disrupting and disturbing our world, and we're determined to work together very closely as we do that. Thank you.
Thank you. The first question goes to Olivia Gadsden.
All right, well, that was Antony Blinken and David Cameron, who was the United States Secretary of State and our Foreign Secretary, reacting after their meeting that they held. Let's go straight back to Scott Lucas, who's still with us, Professor of International Politics at University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Scott, what did you make of what you heard from the 2 men there?
I think there are 3 very, very important takeaways from both the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and from David Cameron. On backing of Ukraine, 15 words from David Cameron that make the headline. We know what works. We know what is needed. We know what's right for us. That's a very powerful message, supporting Antony Blinken in terms of the need to get the U.S. aid package through Congress. But at the same time, and I think Antony Blinken made this clear, if Congress doesn't step up, Europe and the UK now are front and center in providing that vital financial and military aid, some of which that David Cameron set out. For example, the initiative to get hundreds of thousands of artillery shells to Ukraine and the U.S. will support the U.K. and Europe, or the Biden administration will support that, even if the Republicans continue to blockade Congress. Second, on Gaza, it's a really interesting dual message. First, Israel's on notice to get the aid to Gazans back to the levels of before October 7th. That is 500 trucks of aid today. That's still a very limited amount because, of course, Gaza's been blockaded since 2007. But that's the minimum for the U.S. and the U.K. to start to take the pressure off of Israel on the aid question. But at the same time, David Cameron said something which is both notable and troubling. He said, if there is a conflict in Rafah, and I think that's a concession by him, possibly by the Americans, that they know that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is dedicated to attacking that city where 1.3 million Gazans are huddled, trying to find some sort of shelter. And if that attack happens, what is the plan B indeed for the US, the UK, and the rest of the world? And thirdly, because I don't think David Cameron just talked to Donald Trump about Ukraine. I think he may have had other messages, and that other message was about NATO. Given Trump's threats to NATO, notice how Cameron specifically referred to the importance of the NATO summit. That is a signal that NATO is a vital alliance and one that is in the interest of the US to be a central part of, despite Trump's threats. A message of alliance, in other words, with the US, and a very subtle message. We'll see if Donald Trump picks up to him.
All right, Scott Lucas, I'm afraid we have run out of time, but thank you so much for your analysis, telling us what we should have been noticing about those two comments from Blinken and Cameron.